Okay, about this little sidetrack that ended up being a rabbit hole of mammoth proportions. There's currently 2 Scientology cases going down right now. One's criminal, involving Danny Masterson, and the other is civil, involving an ex-Scientologist who is suing for defamation. There's a lot of information coming out about Scientology and its involvement in a lot of things, including human trafficking. I know it seems unrelated, but a single word jumped out at me in the Suzanne Morphew case.
She was making, again, back to Al-Anon, Suzanne was doing some work of recovery and she was starting to see who Suzanne really was.
Did you catch that? She said Al-Anon, which rang a bell. I've heard this before, somewhere else. Al-Anon was also listed in Suzanne's list of grievances in the arrest affidavit. On page 12, she lists mental abuse while drinking. And then over here on page 13, she says, wrote in Al-Anon book. So, I assume she's accusing Barry of writing in her Al-Anon book. But what is Al-Anon? Anyone who has lived with an addict of any sort may be familiar with Al-Anon, or those who have suffered addiction themselves may be familiar with its counterpart. Well, let's start with Al-Anon. What is it? Well, Al-Anon is quite distinct from AA, which is Alcoholics Anonymous. While Alcoholics Anonymous is a type of therapy for the person who is suffering the alcoholic addiction, Al-Anon is a support group to help families and friends of alcoholics to recover from the effects of living with someone whose drinking is a problem. They also have Alateen. They're both very similar in the 12-step program that they teach there, and the reason that I'm familiar with it is because I was once married to an alcoholic. Now, don't get me wrong with what I'm going to say here. I believe these programs could help some people, but the fact is they didn't help us. Al-Anon did not help me dealing with his drinking, and Alcoholics Anonymous did not help him with his drinking. He still drinks to this day, 30 years later. Anyway, rather than bore you with my own story, I'm going to read someone else's story because it pretty much sums up my own experience with Al-Anon. And, well, there is more to the story, but we'll read this first. This story is by Jenny Young. She's a professor and humour writer of Huffington Post. She says, I walked out of Al-Anon and never went back. For those of us who love addicts, cold turkey is the only withdrawal method that works. God grant me the serenity. You will have heard that mantra in Alcoholics Anonymous as well. I was failing before the first line was over. I had zero interest in serenity. I wanted solutions. By the time I walked into that church basement, I was desperate. My partner couldn't quit drinking, or wouldn't quit drinking. I'm still not sure, but maybe the important part is that he had no interest in quitting drinking. It took me far too many years to accept this. Our lives were unravelling. I was unravelling. For the first time in my adult life, and I recognise how obnoxious this sounds, I found myself in a situation I couldn't figure out on my own. I assumed these Al-Anon people could help me solve it. Unlike Jenny, I always found myself in these situations and still do. It turns out that's not what they do, nor do they claim to. It says right on their website that sobriety is not the goal. So I'm not blaming Al-Anon. I just misunderstood what it was all about. Al-Anon is a support group and I wanted a think tank. I've always been more oriented towards fixing than coping. It's probably a character flaw. And I agree with Jenny on that. It probably is a character flaw. I'm always oriented towards fixing as well. The goal of Al-Anon is to help people find their own happiness in a way that is separate from and not dependent upon whether their loved one is drinking. And here's the problem that presented to me. My partner had been my happiness. He had been my best friend. If he was gone, and it was clear by then that the person I fell in love with was gone, I didn't see the point. What Al-Anon teaches us to do is to separate yourself from the alcoholism, and by extension from the alcoholic. The point is to create distance and relinquish all attempts at control. The program teaches you to tamp down the emotion, to subtract the emotion, really, so you can survive from day to day. I understand the utility and perhaps the necessity of these efforts, and I concede that they are logical and practical, but I knew it wouldn't work for us. We were never together for logical reasons. We believed practicality to be an inferior dimension over which we floated like vapor. We were all emotion and all raw spirit, all mystical communication. There was zero distance between us, and we weren't capable of operating as if there were. We were watertight and tongue and groove, or we were nothing at all. This, I now understand, is part of the sickness. My partner was addicted to alcohol. He was addicted to intensity. He was addicted to chaos. And he may or may not have been addicted to me. I was definitely addicted to him, which is apparently typical. Eventually, the addictions intersect and then double back on each other until everyone involved is spinning around in a tangle of calamity, grabbing and clawing, retreating and hiding, but no one ever escapes. Al-Anon acknowledges that the more you love the alcoholic, the more you will suffer, and then it teaches you how to dwell within that suffering. But it seemed to me, as we progressed from woman to woman telling her story around the circle, that the suffering did not abate, it just changed forms. These women were not furious like I was. They were not distraught. They did not rail and smoulder. They didn't plead for renewal, didn't rally for revolution. But what I saw in their faces, in the slopes of their shoulders, and in the heaviness of their bones, seemed far worse. Resignation had settled into their skin and pulled their faces down into the jowls. It had muted everything into a greying sameness that reeked of decay. One young woman, when it was her turn to talk, shared a story about her husband having an episode of alcohol-induced psychosis in front of their little daughter. The child was terrified, just like the last time, and worse than the first time. The next woman spoke of the drug diazepam and how it had been a godsend until it morphed into the agent of evil itself. She seemed almost nostalgic for the good old days of straight-up alcoholism. If the withdrawal drug for alcohol was diazepam and he was addicted to that, then what was the withdrawal drug for diazepam? Was there an end to this? There were not enough drugs in the world. An elderly woman described her husband collapsing in a seizure, vomiting on himself and losing consciousness. She was physically unable to move him. She called 911 and reported this to us as though it equated to scheduling an appointment for teeth cleaning, which only seemed absurd until she revealed how frequently this particular incident had occurred. She sounded sad about it, not shocked or disturbed. The others in the circle nodded sympathetically, commiserating. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throttle them all. I know that's unfair. But at what point does coping or serenity in spite of become sanctioning abuse? At what point does it become complicity? It seemed like a very fine line. Anyway, she goes on to explain that Al-Anon basically teaches you that, okay, coping with it. Not that, you're a better person, you need to leave, you need to pick yourself up off the floor and regain who you are and leave and have the confidence to do it. It doesn't teach you any of that. It just teaches you how to withdraw and put up with it. So that was my experience with Al-Anon as well. But here's the strange thing. They gave me a book to take it home to read called Dianetics by L. Ron Hubbard. They said in this book that I would learn coping strategies. And I had no idea at this point in my life who L. Ron Hubbard was, or even of the existence of Scientology. It would be many, many years later when I realised I had actually dodged a bullet when I decided that I couldn't really afford to pay for their program to improve myself. I wasn't even a drinker. So both Al-Anon and AA have tried to distance themselves from their Scientology origins. And the only reason I know that's their origin is because, hubby bought a book home as well by none other than L. Ron Hubbard. Otherwise, all you'll find out there on the internet is Narcanon's association with Scientology. Understanding what Scientology teaches you in these programs is the key to understanding why Al-Anon teaches you that it's not necessarily your fault that that person is drinking, but it's your fault that you're not dealing with it. It's got a much more positive spin on it these days since they've disassociated from Scientology, but that is essentially, what they were trying to teach us in Al-Anon. If there's something wrong in your life, Scientology teaches you that you've brought it upon yourself, that there's something that you're not dealing with and that you have to find a better way to deal with it. And so in the Danny Masterson case, that's what they were telling the victims, that it was their fault. They weren't dealing with things properly. Anyway, that's why I picked up on the word Al-Anon, because I'm familiar with what Al-Anon is. But then I went back to the arrest affidavit, and there's a lot of talk about Suzanne being the drinker. So on page 22 it says, when agents asked Barry if Suzanne had been drinking, he said he did not pay much attention because he wanted to have a good night with her. And I'm just going to skip through, all the mentions of drinking. Barry stated on page 27, I know we sat down at the lake for a while. I'd say we were gone for an hour and a half, maybe, he added, and it was actually a good day. She didn't drink at all. He's still saying it's her that was the drinker, but Al-Anon isn't for the drinker. Al-Anon is for people who are living with drinkers. And then down here he says, Barry said, just had a wonderful evening and she was perfectly fine because there was no alcohol in her. He again said he asked her not to drink that night. I'm starting to wonder if it was Suzanne who was asking him not to drink, because in her 50 list of grievances she talks about the mental abuse while he's drinking. He's certainly trying to put across the theory that she was the drinker. The alcohol got worse and worse. I'm on page 29. The alcohol got worse and worse and worse those last 3 months, and she was drinking every single day. Down the page a bit further, because she started drinking. Barry stated because she started drinking in response to the statement by CBI that he and Suzanne's behaviour got worse the minute the girls left on the trip. And she was drinking the whole time. He has to keep throwing this drinking accusation in here. In March 2020, Suzanne told Barry the following, "This is all I hear every day. This is all I hear every day. What I'm not, what I should think. I'm not listening to that anymore. Listen to me. Listen to me," Barry interrupting. "Listen to me. Listen to me. I have lived for years being told how I should feel, how I should act, how I should look, what I should drink, what I shouldn't drink, what I should put in my body, what I shouldn't put in my body." Okay, so Barry is riding her ass about drinking, but I still don't understand the connection because she's not at AA, she's at Al-Anon. Okay, more about the drinking. For Sunday, May the 10th, Morgan wrote that she heard Barry's truck at 5 a.m. She added 11:15, Barry called he was out of breath, panting but fatigued, kind of like hungover, but he doesn't drink. So Morgan believes that he doesn't drink. Yet Suzanne has written that he does drink. And then page 61. Barry later said, and I was afraid that talking to the FBI, and when we talked about this situation and they said she could have left on her own, I said the only reason she would leave is because she wouldn't have me hounding her about her problems, and she was free to drink, free to drug and do all that. Greasing referenced her music, books, drinking IPAs, and the bike riding as being pieces of her new life with her new lover, that he was encouraging her to find her true self, and Suzanne was looking for a new life. Barry told investigators early on that he blamed alcohol for Suzanne's change of behaviour and her distant unlovingness to him, though she was not a heavy drinker. Barry used alcohol, drugs, and chemo throughout his interviews to describe Suzanne's independence and distancing from him, saying it was every day that last week. Make up your mind, she's a heavy drinker and you're riding her ass all the time, or she's not. So it's all very interesting because I'm getting the impression that Suzanne's involvement with Al-Anon is telling her that it's her that's not dealing with things. She's got to find a different way to deal with things, that she should stay with Barry and just put up with things and find a way to deal with it. Barry's riding her ass about drinking, even though he says she's not really a heavy drinker. So I think this was part of the abuse pattern, maybe. But I haven't included it in the story of Suzanne because I don't want to paint her as a drinker until I'm sure that she actually was a drinker, that she had a drinking problem. Because I feel that the mention of Al-Anon by both Melinda and Suzanne is an indication that she was going there because Barry was a drinker, because Barry's mental abuse while she was drinking. But she also mentions physical abuse in her list, 60 lines of grievances that she uploaded to her iCloud. Anyway, I just wanted to point all of that out and maybe see what you guys think. The Al-Anon stuff to me seems to be like an addition to all of the abuse. But maybe it's different in America, and maybe it's different now because, I'm talking with my experience 35 years ago, and they've clearly disassociated themselves from Scientology since then. But Barry does harp on a lot about her putting substances in her body, and that is also a Scientology thing, which would seem to be a little bit at odds with his Christianity. So what do you guys think? Do you think Melinda and Suzanne are mixing up the AA with Al-Anon? I have to wonder if Barry accusing Suzanne of being the drinker is not another Darvo deal. But yeah, it's just food for thought. Let me know in the comments what you think.